I thought I had finally inherited a fortune that would set us free, but the documents hidden in my handbag were actually a death sentence. By the time I realized my husband was secretly shielding me from a dangerous organized scheme, the people hunting us were already turning the front door handle. The smell of old parchment and expensive leather still clung to my coat as I stepped out of the notary's office, the cool autumn air biting at my cheeks. I clutched my handbag tightly, feeling the weight of the thick envelope tucked inside, a weight that felt like freedom, security, and a future I had only dared to dream of during the hardest years of our marriage. Aunt Evelyn had always been the black sheep of the family, a woman who lived in the shadows of high society and whispered about secret investments, but I never expected her to leave everything to me. As I navigated the bustling city streets, my mind was a whirlwind of calculations. The house, the properties, the silent accounts. My husband, Mark, had been working double shifts for months, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who thought we were barely keeping our heads above water. Tonight, that would end. I imagined the look on his face when I laid the documents on the dining table, the sheer relief that would wash away the tension that had been thickening between us like a winter fog. I reached our driveway just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows against the brickwork of our home. I fumbled for my keys, my heart racing with the anticipation of sharing the secret that would change our trajectory forever. I didn't wait for him to greet me. I burst through the front door, the envelope held aloft like a winning lottery ticket. "Mark!" I called out, my voice ringing through the quiet hallway. "Mark, you won't believe the news. The inheritance. It's finalized. We're actually free." I waited for the usual heavy thud of his boots or the weary sigh of a man coming home from a long day at the warehouse. But the house was unnervingly silent. There was no radio playing, no sound of the television, not even the hum of the refrigerator. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. The living room was dark, save for the flickering orange glow of a single streetlight filtering through the blinds. On the coffee table, a glass of half-finished whiskey sat untouched, a coaster beneath it perfectly centered. It was unlike him to leave a mess, and even more unlike him to be this quiet. "Mark?" I stepped into the kitchen, my brow furrowing as I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. The lock mechanism clicked back. A cold breeze swept through the gap, making the curtains dance like ghosts. My stomach dropped. I walked toward the back door, and that's when I saw it. A large black duffel bag resting on the kitchen island, half-zipped, revealing the metallic gleam of illegal weapons shoved hastily into the lining. My breath hitched. I retreated a step, my hand trembling as it hovered over the bag, but the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside froze me in my tracks. A car, a black sedan I didn't recognize, slowed to a halt right in front of our porch. Through the window, I watched as two men in dark, heavy coats stepped out. They weren't police. There was a predatory stillness to the way they moved, a professional lethality that made my blood run cold. They weren't looking for a lost neighbor. They were scanning the house, their eyes moving with the precision of a hunting pack. I turned to run back toward the hallway, desperate to find my phone, when my eyes caught a second envelope resting right next to the bag of weaponry. It was addressed to me in Mark's unmistakable, rushed handwriting. I tore it open, my fingers slick with sweat. The note was short, only 2 sentences that made the world tilt on its axis. "Whatever you do, don't go into the basement. They aren't looking for me. They're looking for what you just inherited." Before I could even process the warning, the front door handle began to turn with a slow, deliberate click. The metallic scrape of the key in the lock sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the hallway. I didn't think. I reacted. With a gasping breath, I grabbed the note and crumpled it into my pocket, shoved the bag of illegal weapons further behind the kitchen island, and ducked into the narrow pantry. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was certain the men entering the house would hear it. The front door creaked open, and the heavy rhythmic thud of boots announced the intruders. "The wife arrived 20 minutes ago," a voice rasped, cold and devoid of any human warmth. It was a professional tone, the kind that didn't belong in a suburban home on a Tuesday evening. "She's here, and she has the ledger." I covered my mouth with both hands, my eyes wide and stinging with unshed tears. The ledger? Aunt Evelyn had mentioned a list of names, but she called it an asset log. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't about inheritance money anymore. This was about a trail of evidence that could pull us into a nightmare of organized schemes. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen. I watched through the crack in the pantry door as the shadows of two men elongated across the floorboards. One of them stopped right by the kitchen island, his hand brushing against the very duffel bag I had tried to hide. "She's been to the notary," the second man said, his voice closer now. "The paperwork is processed. Once she signs the final transfer, the entire network is exposed. We can't let her leave this house with those documents." My lungs burned. I had the documents in my bag sitting right there on the kitchen chair, just 5 feet away from the men who were clearly ready to end me. I realized then that Mark hadn't just been working at a warehouse. He had been protecting me from a life he had been forced into. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was part of this organized scheme, and by accepting this inheritance, I had inadvertently become the most dangerous person in the room. "Check the pantry," the first man commanded. My survival instinct flared. I spotted the small service hatch in the back of the pantry, an old dumbwaiter shaft we had never opened since moving in. It was a tight squeeze, meant for groceries, not a panicked woman. As the pantry door handle began to jiggle, I threw my weight against the wooden panel of the hatch. It gave way with a splintering crack. I scrambled inside, skinning my elbows and knees, just as the pantry door swung open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty shelves where I had been standing a second before. "She's gone," one of them growled. "Check the basement door. If she's down there, she's cornered." Mark's warning, I thought, my mind racing as I shimmied down the narrow shaft. He had told me not to go to the basement, but he hadn't told me where else to go. As I reached the bottom of the shaft and pushed open the exit, I found myself not in the cellar, but in a hidden crawl space that ran the entire length of the house. I crawled forward, the dirt floor damp and cold against my palms, until I reached a small ventilation grate that looked out into the yard. Through the slats, I saw a familiar figure standing near the perimeter fence. It was Mark. He was holding a phone to his ear, his face etched with a despair I had never seen before. Behind him, a car was idling, its headlights pointed toward the woods behind our property. He wasn't running away. He was setting a trap. I reached out to tap on the grate to get his attention, but my hand froze. 2 more men were emerging from the woods behind him, weapons drawn and leveled at his back. He didn't see them. He was too focused on the house, unaware that the real threat wasn't just the men inside, but the ones surrounding him. Just as he turned to look toward the kitchen window, he tripped a wire, and a blinding flare erupted in the darkness, turning the entire backyard into a stage of chaotic shadows and flashes of light. Mark went down, and the men started firing into the void. The roar of the discharge was deafening, a staccato rhythm that tore through the quiet night and vibrated in my chest. I watched in paralyzed horror as Mark tumbled behind the thick oak tree near the edge of the property, his movements frantic and desperate. He wasn't armed with anything but a cell phone and what looked like a remote detonator. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to bury them in the dirt to steady myself. The flare light began to flicker and die, plunging the yard back into a jagged, strobe-like darkness where the men, the criminals hunting us, were advancing with terrifying, calculated precision. I couldn't just stay in this hole while he was out there bleeding. I needed to move. I remembered the small emergency kit Mark had stashed in the crawl space years ago, a relic from when we first bought the fixer-upper. I fumbled in the dark until my fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a flare gun, an old maritime model, and a heavy flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. I scrambled toward the end of the crawl space, emerging through a loose floorboard in the laundry room, shielded by the heavy oak door. I peeked out. The house was deathly quiet now. The two men who had been inside must have exited through the back, alerted by the gunfire in the yard. I was alone, but I was also inches away from the kitchen table where my bag lay, the bag containing the inheritance papers. I knew those documents were the bait. If I took them, I was a target. If I left them, I was leaving behind the only proof of why this was happening. I snatched the bag, my heart hammering like a trapped bird, and sprinted for the back exit. The night air hit me like a wall. I stayed low, creeping toward the tree line where Mark had vanished. The sounds of shifting gravel and hushed, aggressive whispers guided my way. I heard one of them speak, his voice dripping with malice. "He's got nowhere to go. Search the perimeter. If he doesn't have the codes, the boss will have our heads." The codes. Aunt Evelyn's inheritance wasn't just properties and cash. It was the access keys to the organized scheme that these people were running. I finally understood the magnitude of the asset log. I crept closer, the grass damp against my knees, until I saw Mark. He was huddled against the oak, clutching his shoulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was trying to press a sequence into his phone, his eyes darting frantically toward the house. I saw the opportunity. One of the radicals was circling the tree, his weapon raised, oblivious to the fact that I was positioned directly behind a cluster of bushes to his left. I stood up, my breath hitching, and leveled the flare gun. My aim was shaky, my vision blurring, but I knew I couldn't miss. I didn't fire at him. I fired at the dry brush pile about 10 feet away, creating an instant, blinding wall of fire that roared to life between the attacker and my husband. The man stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the sudden, intense heat. Mark looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the chaos. For a fleeting second, there was no fear, only an intense, unspoken apology. He reached out, his hand desperate, but then he stiffened. A red laser dot appeared on his chest, hovering right over his heart, steady and unblinking. It wasn't coming from the men in the yard. It was coming from the second-story window of our own home. My pulse skipped. I looked up. A silhouette stood in the window, a figure I recognized instantly. It was my lawyer, the man who had handed me the documents just hours ago. He wasn't a solicitor. He was the overseer. He had been orchestrating this entire hunt from the beginning, waiting for me to lead the players to the prize. He raised his hand, gesturing for me to drop the bag, his lips curling into a cruel, satisfied smile. Before I could shout a warning, a sharp crack echoed from the house, and the air around Mark shattered. The bullet whistled past Mark's ear, carving a jagged trench into the bark of the oak tree. The sound acted as a catalyst, snapping me out of my paralyzing shock. I didn't drop the bag, I hurled it, not at the lawyer, but toward the dense, overgrown hedge that lined the neighbor's property. As the lawyer shifted his focus to the trajectory of the flying bag, Mark lunged, tackling the gunman who had been distracted by the fire I'd started. The chaos was absolute, a maelstrom of shadow and desperation. I didn't wait for the resolution. I sprinted toward the house, my lungs burning, fueled by a singular cold fury. I knew that lawyer wouldn't come down to retrieve the papers himself. He was a coward who liked to watch his schemes play out from a distance. I burst through the back door and took the stairs 2 at a time, moving with a silent, primal speed that surprised even me. As I reached the study, I found him, standing by the window, his hand still resting on the frame, his eyes fixed on the struggle below. He was so confident in his control that he didn't even hear me enter until I slammed the heavy, decorative marble bookend against the side of his head. He crumpled, his composure shattering instantly. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed his phone from the desk, the device he was using to coordinate the hit, and dialed the number he had been watching. It was the emergency line for the Service of Internal Safety. "I have a situation," I whispered, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I have the evidence of an organized scheme. I have the leader of the cell, and I have the names. I'm ready to hand it all over, provided you remove the immediate threats on my property." The voice on the other end was professional, cool, and surprisingly quick to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the local police, but the specialized units that handled those who tried to break the law with such arrogance. The men in the yard, seeing the blue and red lights flashing against the tree line, scattered like rats, abandoning their objective. Mark dragged himself toward the porch, clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide as he looked up at the window where I stood. The lawyer bound with the very tape we used for holiday packing. The following weeks were a blur of intense questioning and protection. The inheritance was not a fortune to be enjoyed. It was a digital graveyard of secrets that had been used to hold half the city hostage. By handing over the ledger and the lawyer, we triggered a chain reaction that dismantled the organized scheme, piece by piece. We were granted immunity in exchange for our cooperation, but the life we had known, the quiet house, the simple dreams, was gone, replaced by the necessity of moving to a city where no one knew our names. I sat in a small, rented apartment in a state thousands of miles away, watching the sun rise over a skyline that felt foreign, but for the first time in years, peaceful. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, his shoulder finally healing, reading a book. He looked up, catching my eye, and smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that I hadn't seen since our wedding day. The heavy duffel bag was gone. The lawyer was facing an enormous multi-decade term in a facility where he would never be able to pull a trigger again, and the weight of the past was finally lifting. I walked over and placed a hand on the table. We had lost everything we owned, every possession and memento, but we had reclaimed something far more valuable: the truth. I looked at the morning paper, at a small column mentioning the takedown of a sophisticated criminal network, and felt a surge of cold, righteous satisfaction. We were no longer hiding, and for the first time, we weren't waiting for the next shoe to drop. We were starting over, not with an inheritance of money, but with the hard-won, beautiful liberty of a life reclaimed from the shadows. The nightmare was over, and the future, however uncertain, belonged entirely to us.